Randy and Scott are netting, doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Houston.
Yes, sir.
You
And
know, so they're yeah. Go ahead.
I'd be happy to share my personal story if you'd like.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Because that was exactly me when I met y'all. And
Yeah.
except for the fact that I had cut, so I was at $30,000 a
Hmm.
month for years before we met. But
Yeah.
then, but remember, I had just dropped to like half of that during the pandemic,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's when we met. And
Hmm.
and then I came back from the pandemic. Like in the first couple months, I was back to the 30. Once we were allowed to open.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
but then after that, like we got to 60 average in relatively short time. And when I'm doing everything I'm supposed to, I've had some way higher months. The record month was
Hmm.
94.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the point of the story being that like it's not just all the stuff that you guys teach, but it's also just being around it regularly and remembering, because we know there's the things that we know, and there's the things that we know that we don't know, and it's the things that
Hmm.
we know that we don't know that'll get us. But we also know that we're not even always doing all the things that we do know.
Yeah.
And so those are so the group. All I'm saying is to everyone, because I think most of the people on here probably aren't actually on the group yet, right? So I'm just
Yeah.
letting everybody know that once we became a part of your organization, it changed my life. It changed all my people's lives because I've been able to. I had a dream for years before that I'd be able to pay people a truly professional wage so they could
Yeah.
do this for a career, and now we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
you were almost quoting Donald Rumsfeld there. What was his deal? There are things we know that we know. There are things we know that we don't know, and there are things that we don't know that we don't know. Unknown unknowns, which I thought was a pretty interesting distinction. Things we don't know we should know that we don't know. And to be fair, again, not to speak ill of an old friend of mine, but you had worked with Greg Sola for years up to that point. What was the difference in what your foundation and prep was from? And we encounter that a lot. We get a lot of people who have gotten to 20 or 30,000 by kind of working with whoever else that might be in the industry. And again, many of them are old friends of mine. They've worked with Dave Kovar, Greg Silva, or um, uh, what's his name, Garcia, Paul
Well,
Garcia. Yeah,
and beyond that, sir. Like,
yeah,
and by the way, I'm grateful for how far he had brought me to that point. But then
sure, sure,
then you took me to the next level. But I
yeah,
also have an MBA that I paid a
yeah,
lot of money for, and I learned a lot more in my time with you than,
yeah.
than I did in that MBA. So and this is all of course, totally unsolicited. You didn't know I was even going to speak today, but
I didn't
but
know you were going to be on the meeting today.
you didn't even know I was going to be on the meeting today,
Yeah.
but honestly, the reason I'm on the meeting today is because you were sending out stuff that is marketing stuff,
Hmm.
and but I was going, damn, I forgot about that. We got to be doing that. And I'm like, right,
Yeah.
even being in the group, I'm like, I got to get back, and I gotta, so I'm trying to make sure I show up to some of these as well, and to the quick start as well, things other than just the leadership meeting. And
Yes.
because that's the thing, we got to stay sharp wherever we are in the law of the process.
You bet. You bet. The what would you say was what? As Greg Silla asked me this too. Um, what was he said it to me of how did I light a fire under your ass to get you to uh, uh, jump up to that level or something like that. And uh, I think I told you that my response had been, well, I think COVID lit the fire, and you said, well, that wasn't really the deal, and I said I was trying to be nice to an old friend. But what would you say was the impetus?
Well, I think that number one of the, and I still teach a lot of the teaching stuff that I learned from Grandmaster
Hmm.
Silva, and
Hmm.
so he had helped me become a really great teacher.
Hmm.
Really great at the craft, and he had, when I met him, I didn't even have contracts, so he
Hmm.
had, so he had taught me some of the basics of getting to a certain
Yeah.
level. I think that honestly, there was a level of I think two things. One, in the actual curriculum, in the pedagogy, there was a lot more specifics on things like proper pricing, um, better marketing, and then especially like how to properly do renewal programs, which we used to call upgrade programs back then. and stuff like that, all the that stuff. And then, but
Mhm.
that's the curriculum and pedagogy side. And then on on the other side, honestly, was in that pond, I was a big fish.
Mhm.
And so when I got it amongst so many other people that were already $1 million dojos, which had only been an idea for me, and the now I'm kind of in striking distance, and I'm getting close, and but I didn't. You know how I bet you everybody on the call can relate to this part is there's those things that you kind of say are a goal, but you don't
Mhm.
really believe you can hit.
Yeah.
And that was I think probably the most important change for me was the change of mindset that, oh, this is actually doable, and if he can do it and she can do it, I can do it.
Mhm.
And so I think that was a big piece of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of, I mean, this is many, many years ago now, but it was uh 2 or 3 years after John Graydon had founded NAPA. And, if people don't know the story, is he had founded it with the help of myself, Jeff Smith, Steve LaValle, and to a lesser extent, Tom Callis. But a whole lot of a bunch of his material that he was using was my stuff or Jeff Smith stuff. And um, but I had talked to him probably 3 years, after he had founded it, and I had said, "Well, how's it going? And what are you happy about? What are you frustrated about?" And the one thing I remember is he said, "Well, going really well. We have a lot of schools, but the problem is I'm a big fish in the little pond rather than the small fish in the big pond like I used to be when I was hanging out with you guys, right?" So, when he was around us, he was the fly on the wall listening to the heavy hitters. And, he had come to Denver a couple times, seeing our extravaganzas and one thing or another. And then again, when he did his first book, he had given it to me and I had made copies and given it to people, and he got mad. And I said, "Well, why are you mad at that? Half the stuff is my stuff, the other half was Jeff Smith's stuff, and you didn't credit anybody other than, to be fair, he said thank you to me and Jeff Smith and I think LaValle in the introduction." Um, but that's the reaction in almost all cases is people are in a group where the guys who are teaching the YMCA are getting to a point where they're, having a full-time living, but it's not where the heavy hitters are hanging out. Or in some cases, even the people in the leadership used to be the ones that were a fly on the wall. And in Greg's case, he ran a very big school in Clearwater for a while. Now the top line numbers never matched the bottom line numbers. In other words, he was talking about 1,000-person school, but really he had 250, 300 families, and the net profit was never very good on that. When I wrote that first book, the Everything I Wish I Knew When I Was 22 book, was a chapter about him in that. And in his credit, he called me and said, "I wish somebody had told me that to begin with." And I said, "Well, Greg, I told you about stuff time. You just didn't want to listen at the time." So I used to sit in his office and go through the P&L, and told him, among other things, to get rid of the pro shop and to, the family thing he was doing was kind of squirrely. But really, he was trying to just position himself to do United Professionals and, throw up numbers that sounded good. Um, but uh, but that's interesting. For everybody's benefit, what I did when I started this thing is it was all one-on-one calls and all by telephone. And Steve, what you just said was the rationale for getting rid of that is what happened is most people wouldn't say this, but two things happened. One, if I had 30 one-on-one meetings, I really only had three conversations, 10 times, on three different topics. But the second thing that happened is I kept sensing that when I said, in today's terms, you should be charging $397 a month, people would be, "Well, maybe you can do it. You're a cross between Tony Robbins and Zig Ziglar, but I can't do it. You don't know my market. You don't know my area. You don't know my staff." But then when, you've got Krista or Jason or Brandy or whoever on the meeting, you then don't have the excuse of you can't do it in my area because you've got everything from Mankato, Minnesota, to Houston, to Seattle, to uh, um, suburban Jacksonville, whatever, on the meeting. And you also recognize that there are people who aren't just naturally gifted at sales or naturally gifted at anything. And that wasn't me either, because I wasn't doing the sales. It was my idiot 22-year-old program director that's trying to follow the script. Right. So in most cases, um, going back to what Gemma was saying about her brother, a lot of schools, their initial knee-jerk reaction is, all you're going to do is tell me to raise my prices and I can't charge anymore in my area, which we know is, one, it's false. Gemma, that you had mentioned that school down in Miami, that they're charging $600 a month and you hope to visit them. I doubt if there's anything to learn from them other than they're charging $600 a month, right?
Yeah.
Um, and and our top schools are charging $600 a month. They're just doing it to second tier. And frankly, I'd rather them be doing that on the way in the door. It's just, closest I've got anybody so far is, what was it, Stephen, 2 meetings ago, a whole bunch of them, made a pact that they would actually do the 397 and started doing it. And in fact, Jason, went a little over 400 and then, chickened out a little bit, but he does that stupid every 2 week thing anyway. Which, Jan Lappin managed to infect people with that crap. But what would you add to that, Stephen? Is that all sound about right?
Well, I can certainly say that every time, we're not quite to those yet, but every time we've gone up, and right now we knocked down to 297 on our basic entry program, and we're at 447 on our leadership program. So not quite to that, but when I met you, we were doing 150 on all the programs. And actually, I think we went from 150 to 169 when we went to black belt training. So when I first at that time, my very first jump was just to go to 300 on when I created the leadership program. And I said, we're going to grandfather everybody in. You guys are going to get in at only 300. And that was that was years ago, but that was the first step up. And I will say that every time, I mean, it's not like we're enrolling less people because of it. I do believe our value has continued to get better and better as well. But I also would support what you said, that it was maybe the other way around, not the it wasn't that I had to get the value up first and then raise it was the other way around. Like, it just pressures you to do better. Right. Especially because I will say one of the most pleasant changes of all because at the same time, I consciously changed the demographic I was marketing to. And so, which makes sense, because most of the time people that can afford more are otherwise in a different demographic too. And I can say that life also got easier when like we have a great culture with nobody that complains, and none of the it's never the person, it's never the guy that gave me $30,000 paid in full for his leadership program that complains about it.
That whines and moans.
Yeah. So it's
yeah. Well, and I would say the thing you said about pricing is pretty much true across the board. Is all of these others, and I haven't been very charitable in calling it the bozo explosion across the board. And truthfully, Greg did a great job in translating a very complicated Kimpo curriculum into something that was simple enough to teach and replicate, and a modular system that was kind of developed from what we were doing, back in the day on rotating curriculum. And Dave Tovar is very good at instructor motivation and floor systems and so forth, but neither one of them really had the depth of understanding of the business systems. And Stephen, as you know, the MBA isn't the deciding factor. Although my process of going through the MBA was kind of helpful, because I already had in today's term, a $5 million operation and multi locations. The irony is other than the director of the program, who was the marketing guy, most of the professors were telling me what I was doing was impossible until they found out I was doing it. So they didn't have much of a clue, honestly. But I mean, we know it's a very simple business when you boil it down. It's what's the average value per student, how many new students do you get in the door, how long do you keep them, right? So if you only followed three metrics, it's what's your monthly dropout rate, what's your average monthly revenue or lifetime value per student, and how effective is your marketing to get enough new people in the door to hit your growth targets, right? And of course, each of those we can subset. How do we get the average revenue per student up? It can be we're charging them more initially, we're charging them more monthly, we're renewing them or upgrading them to a higher level program at a higher tuition point. Um, and that puts together where most of the $1 million schools, Stephen, you were probably on that meeting. They're mostly in the $8,000 to $9,000 lifetime value range right now, and they're mostly in the 350 to 400 average revenue per month range per student. And Gemma, from your brother's knee-jerk reaction, fixing his pricing would turn his gross into his net, right? So instead of bragging about 40,000 a month or 50,000 a month gross, he could be doing that in net. And then it's a matter of retention and marketing. And the problem I find with most people who are um, they're doing good enough marketing to get enough people is they don't have the parts of they almost always have a couple of things that are going well. Maybe they found an agency that did well for them on online marketing, or they've got, one or two things that are working. And the problem with one or two things that are working is sooner or later it doesn't work. I was talking to Dan Kennedy just before we walked into this meeting, and Matt Smith and I were having this conversation yesterday. I used to be able to buy the back cover of the TV Guide and two daily newspapers, drove them all to a phone number. They would call the phone number. 80% would make an appointment. 80% would come to an intro. 80% would enroll. We didn't have to chase anybody down. I could do it with 160,000 a year in advertising, and it was a much easier day and age when that was the traffic. But that day and age is dead. Nowadays an awful lot of the lead flow you're getting is they fill in a form on the website, and you have to chase them down to convert them to an appointment, and then go through the process from there. Gemma, with regard to the seminars, the same dynamic you hit is, you know 40 years ago, I killed off doing lead boxes, because what we were having is we had a boiler room, 5 people at night making outbound calls on lead boxes. We were flooding so much flaky traffic into the school that it was getting in the way of the quality traffic. And I decided I'd rather just spend the money than to do that and chase that down. In your case, one of the things that you can certainly ramp up is the paid Google, paid, social media side of it. But we just haven't seen a replacement to more or less a third, a third, a third internal referral systems. One example is Jason has done a really fabulous job with birthday parties, with external community outreach. I haven't seen anybody do as well with elementary schools and so forth as I did over the years, but like Chris is doing a really good job of consistent live event marketing. A lot of the schools are doing a good job. Brandy and Scott, how they did 100 enrollments in 3 or 4 weeks last summer with just July 4th live events and so forth. But I've never seen a replacement of about a third of them online, about a third from internal stuff that you've developed with buddy days and referral events, and about a third from live community outreach, but then have 20 things going on every month. Because again, something's going to die. The newspaper ads that I was doing did really well until it died. The infomercial we were doing did really well until it died. The after school program things were just she so much traffic in, we couldn't handle it all until it got shut completely down. So you've got to have a lot of things going on so you never lose that. But ultimately, when you're evaluating the school, is how long you keep them, what they're paying, and are you getting enough new people in the door? And then it's subsetting those three areas to make sure that each of the components is working. And so, Stephen, if you wanted to get to 90,000, fix your pricing. You know, get consistent with the marketing and fix your pricing because you're still, especially on the renewal, you're still really low.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Good. Any other questions before we call it a day? I'll remind everybody, I think the video and the